Okay, so this is 8.5, part 2. And so, boy, chapter 8. Some people tell me that chapter 8 is the hardest chapter. And so here we are on 8.5, part 2. I think that if you practice, it's not the hardest chapter. But if you just think looking at it one time and not doing some practice on your own, it'll work out just fine. Or just practicing very little, it'll work out just fine. Not probably going to be right on that. And so, but I think if you practice, it works out pretty good. Had a lot of people come in to practice, and so that's good. Okay, when an equation has two radicals, get one radical isolated and use the principle of powers. So this is what we have going here is we have two radicals, and it tells us, hey, the story is to try to get the radicals isolated one at a time. Well, that one's isolated, and just luckily, that one's isolated too. And so they're both isolated. And so I'm going to square both sides. And because I have variables here on both sides, I have variable. I don't have this is not a number on this side or a negative. It's not a positive number or a negative number. It's a variable. So you're going to have to check. So we'll be ready to check. So 2t minus 7, I'm going to square. And on the other side, and when I say to myself that it's a variable on both sides, I know that, hey, you're going to have to check. But you probably already know about me. I check every time. And so that's good. And so square and square root undo one another. So I just have here 2t minus 7 equals, and the square and square root undo one another, and I have 3t minus 12. And then hot diggity dog, I can solve that. This is just my friend, the linear equation that I learned about in chapter 1, where the strategy is to get them separated. So you take away 3t from both sides to get the t's on one side, perhaps, and you add 7 to both sides to get the numbers on the other side, perhaps. You get 1t equals negative 5, and then you divide both sides by negative 1. Maybe you did it differently. And are already done solving and asking me what took me so long, right? So my hypothesized answer is 5. I won't know for sure that it's the answer until I check, because it's a good idea to check. It's a must check because we had variable on both sides here. So we're going to be plugging in for t on both sides 5. Oh, I wonder if there's any ice cream in my house. I bet there is not. So here I get 10 take away 7, which is the square root of 3. And all it has to be is equal to the other side, which is 15 take away 12, which is the square root of 3. So these two sides, even though the square root of 3, I don't know it offhand. You might be saying, but I know it. It's 1.7, right? Ish. It goes on from there, right? It's an irrational number, but both sides are equal to the same irrational number. And so what that means about t equals 5 is that it is a good solution because these are equal to one another. So we did a lovely job on it. And we have just one more problem to do. And I'm pretty happy because it's gotten pretty late. And I've been doing videos for a while. And so, so this example here, and you notice it's a mess, and it's got two square roots. And so what they said to do is get the square roots all by themselves one at a time. And the other one, like I didn't have to do anything, and the square roots already behaved. But this square root is not all by itself because it's got the 4 over there. And this one's not all by itself because it's got the 6, right? The plus 6. So, and I'm not going to be able to get the square roots by themselves at the same time, because when I take away 4, I can get this one all by itself. But then that one is not isolated by itself. And so, but what they said to do is they said, just have faith, get them one at a time. So now I'm going to square both sides. So that's my next story, is to square both sides. This side is a monomial. And so it's going to work out well. And this side over here is a binomial. And so when I square that, I'm going to have to do FOIL. So this, when I square both sides, is going to look like this. 10 minus x squared, and that one's going to be easy. And then this side, 2 plus the 4 minus x squared, that's going to be not hard, but FOIL. I'm going to have to use FOIL to get that side. And it's going to look nasty. So this side's going to look nice because the square and the square root undo one another, and I just get 10 minus x. So that side was like friendly. But this side over here is 2 plus 4 minus x square root of, right? Ooh, I got looking at the screen. If I look at the screen and write, it almost makes me dizzy. And it's at this point in the day when I'm so tired that I forget and I look at the screen. I know you're thinking, that's crazy. So this is 4, and this is 2 times the square root, and this one's 2 times the square root. And then look at what you got there. You got the square root of 4 minus x times the square root of 4 minus x. And that's the square root of 4 minus x times underneath the same square root, right? And remember, for every 2 that are the same, 1 comes out. So this is plus 4 minus x. Do you guys agree? There. However you want to say that. Some people say that's because there's 2 of them, they say that's squared, right? And remember, they're squared and it gets rid of the square root. So hot diggity dog. So now on this side, I need to combine like terms and make it look a little bit nicer. 4 plus 4 is 8, and actually it would look a little bit nicer if that was 4 minus 4, but it's not. I don't get to change it. So this is 8 minus x, and then I have 2 square root plus 2 square root is 4 square root, since it's the same square root. Like radical, right? I can add them together. And then now I'm on get this square root all by itself, because the problem had square root. That's the kind of problem this was. So I isolated the square root and squared it. It still has square root. So it's still a square root problem. And so what you want to do is you want to get that square root all by itself and then square both sides. So I want to get this by itself and square both sides. That's my goal. And so I'm going to take away 8. I'm going to add x. And when the dust clears here, I'm going to get 2, and the x's drop out. These went away, that's what I was doing, and I get 4 and then square root of 4 minus x. And this is now a monomial, so I can square both sides without having to use FOIL, without having to do a bunch of multiply, right? And so if you want to divide the 4 and create a little tiny fraction, 1/2, right? 2 divided by 4, great. I think I'm going to do that. Now, from the beginning, because I had the variables here, when I had this one isolated and variables on the both sides, this was a variable, meaning you have to check. And so even though that I get here and I have just the number on the side, because up here I squared both sides, I could have an extraneous solution here. So I am going to square both sides here. And when you square half, that's 1/2 times 1/2, that's 1/4. And when you square a square root, you just get the radicand, the part underneath, back, right? The square and the square root undo one another. And then I'm going to, this is linear, so I'm going to get them separated. I'm going to take away 4 from both sides. 1/4 take away 4. You can use your head or your calculator. So if you're using your head and you say it's -3 3/4, wonderful, equals negative x. And I'm going to divide by -1. If you're using your calculator and your calculator told you that it was negative divided by negative, here is a positive, 3 3/4. Your calculator might have told you this is 12, 13, 14, 15. Your calculator might have told you this is 15/4. Either way, they're the same, right? And so either 3 3/4 or 15/4, whichever one. I didn't want to use my calculator to do it, and so it was easier for me to think of it as a mixed number than it was to think of it as a improper fraction. And then, but remember, I was on must check. So we have 4 plus the square root of 10 minus x equals 6 plus 4 minus x. And we're saying that x is 15/4. So this is 4 plus or 3 3/4. I'm choosing 15/4 because that's easier to put in my calculator than 3 3/4 by one keystroke. And so you know how I am. So this is 4 and then times this, oh, it's not times, it's plus. 4 plus the square root of 10 minus 15/4. So I get 13/2. That must have been a perfect square, right? I didn't know that it was because I didn't find out what it was. I didn't do it by hand. But now that there's no square root in my answer, I know that. And then here I have 6 plus 4 minus 15/4. And that ought to be 13/2 as well. And if it's not 13/2, then that, I'm going to check and make sure I didn't make any mistakes, right? But it might be that it's an extraneous solution. 15/4. But it is. Hot diggity dog. So that means that this 15/4 or 3 3/4 is a good answer. And we're all done with 8.5. And I feel like 8.4 back to back with 8.5 was like, holy cow, is what I'm thinking it was like. And so I hope you enjoyed the video. And we'll look at the next section tomorrow. I don't even know what it is. I'm too tired to know. And so we'll worry about that tomorrow.